We're going to get going. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the blessings that you give us and just all the ways that you're working in this new year. And we just pray that the time that we have together in fellowship today would just be wonderful, that it would be that sweet smelling aroma that rises up before you, and that there would be nothing standing between your word and the fruit that your spirit desires to be born from it, and that we would leave here being more like Christ than we came. Amen. Okay, so we have been looking at the doctrines of man as a partner to the doctrines of God, and over the past several weeks we have been transitioning towards a more holistic, relationally oriented way of looking at the doctrines of man from a more Old Testament perspective. Okay? And we've been using Genesis 1 and 2 as a foundation and some supporting texts throughout Scripture. We've established these kind of three spheres of life: the biological life, the nephesh life, which is also biological, and the spiritual life, which is also nephesh and biological. And last week we started looking at the way that the Old Testament lays out these foundational relationships for people. And so we have a strong implication that, again, humanity, who would be the only creation that we see in Genesis 1 and 2 that extends across all of these levels of life, that we are to cultivate biological life, that we are to shepherd the nephesh animals, okay? And then when it brings it into the spiritual dimension, we see within the husband-wife relationship that there is, according to Paul's interpretation of Genesis chapter 2, in chapter 6 of his letter to the Corinthians, that between people who have been sexually intimate, there is a spiritual degree of connection that is of like kind to the connection that we have with Christ, and even in some way can impact the connection that we have with Christ. And so, following up on that discussion, I want to look at another New Testament interpretation of Genesis chapter 2. But this time, it is not Paul, but it is Jesus in Matthew chapter 19. And it's in verses 3 through 9. And this is probably a familiar passage, but we are going to look at it. And I want to try to bring it into harmony with 1 Corinthians chapter 6 as to what I think is going on here, and then kind of wrap up this area of discussion. All right, so we're actually heading in this way during the main service. But Matthew 19 has two sections that are often addressed. And so this is where we're going to get the rich young ruler. And that comes up a lot. And then this is also the most extensive teaching that we get from Jesus on divorce. And that's actually the foundation of this. So, chapter 19, verse 3. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" All right, and we've talked about this before. Doug has talked about this. So at the time of Christ, there were two primary rabbinical schools of thought. There was the school of Hillel. Hillel was, labels are bad, but if we're going to use them, he was the more liberal, on the more liberal end of the Jewish theological perspective. He was Gamaliel's grandfather. And then there was Shammai, who was on the more conservative end of the Jewish religious spectrum, which even, again, the liberal end of the Jewish religious spectrum at this time was very conservative. And they had differing teachings on divorce. Shammai was, again, more conservative. It was divorce, and I believe it wasn't even for sexual immorality. This is an area in which I have some ignorance. But I think it was sexual immorality during the betrothal period. And you could call off the betrothal. But there's some things that make me think that Shammai, even after marriage, after the actual marriage took place, would say there is no divorce. But I might be wrong right there. Hillel had a much more extensive list of these are areas in which divorce, and it was related to more of like if the spouse was neglecting any of the marital responsibilities, that was a potential grounds for divorce. Like there is one anecdote even concerning the wife's cooking, if she burnt it too much, right? And again, it's related to that's part of the wife's marital responsibilities, and if the wife is failing in those marital responsibilities, there may be grounds for divorce. Okay, I had more hands than what I expected. Jeremiah, can you take this back to Lester, then Lionel, then Vicky? Okay, and we'll just see where we head with this. Okay.
Yes, I was just curious about, let's just say, unfortunately, you're not married to the first person, and you're remarried.
Yeah.
So when that person goes to heaven, which wife is he going to spend an eternity with? The first wife?
Okay, so it's a good question, because the Pharisees themselves asked this question in Matthew chapter 22. Yeah, Matthew 22, a similar question gets asked, and Jesus' response is, we're not actually married after the resurrection in heaven.
And then what happens when, let's say, they're married for a long time,
Okay.
20 odd years, and then what happens after 20 years when the wife says, oh, hon, can I tell you something? I got to clear my conscience. I had an affair on you that lasted a little over a year. So does that free the man if he divorced her? What if he divorced her, though, and didn't find out that information until after? So he couldn't really use that as an excuse. I know I just loaded you up. I'm sorry. You don't have to answer all of that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's the divorce situations can get really, really complicated. Without knowing a significant amount of details, I would probably say that, and again, I hate making these kind of off-the-cuff things. I would probably say if at the time of if that initial divorce was not due to sexual immorality, then that probably was not even the words aren't good, biblical divorce. And there's probably some confession, counseling, and forgiveness that needs to take place in that circumstance. But these are really, really complicated. Just a real quick summary. If I had to do like a 30-second on divorce, the Bible seems to give there's three primary teachings. Number one, it is not God's will that people should get divorced. Number two, if a believer is married to an unbeliever, and that unbeliever wishes to leave the believer, then the believer is to let them go. A legal divorce is appropriate in that circumstance, and that believer then is able to remarry, and if they remarry, it is not considered adultery. All right? So all those conditions need to fall into place. The second circumstance would be any circumstance in which there is habitual, unrepentant sexual immorality that creates that it is possible in that situation that divorce is the most appropriate circumstance, but that is never commanded. And again, it's very complicated. and it needs to be processed through with the church and all that kind of stuff. I hold all of those it firmly in one hand and lightly in another, because again, like I think there's a difference between an act of sexual immorality and a lifestyle of sexual immorality. And I don't think necessarily an act of sexual immorality should lead to divorce. I think forgiveness, repentance is always the default for Christians. These are very complicated situations. The one area that I comment on that I think people have the most problem with is abuse. And as trying to be as biblically sound as I can, I do not personally believe that abuse is a condition for divorce. But I remind people that, abuse is illegal, and don't fall into this false dilemma where I am not saying that on any circumstance a spouse should stay in an abusive situation or a spouse should allow their children to remain in an abusive situation. That is an area where, again, the church needs to get involved, the legal authorities need to get involved, but God takes marriage so seriously. Again, I don't think we get to divorce. And this connects well with what we've been talking about starting last week. I think, and it's a strange way for me saying it, but I think the church has had a very shallow understanding of sexual intimacy and marriage, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit more today. Where, like, when it comes to making that choice to enter into this covenant relationship with another human being, you really got to take this seriously. And it's got to go into it with a lot of wisdom, a lot of counsel. Family needs to be involved. The church needs to be involved. Because, like, when you enter into that covenant relationship, you enter into a commitment and responsibility and a lifestyle that encompasses every aspect of life. And so, like, for people who are married, we need to take our marriages very seriously. And for young people, like, you got to put a lot of thought, and really, like, a lot of thought even into, am I going to enter into this covenant, like, at all? I think Paul encourages Christians to put a lot more thought into that than we kind of do. Before you even get to the idea of, like, do I want to enter into that covenant with this particular person? And I don't think we have enough of these conversations within the Western Protestant church. And that's because, which the divorce statistics within the church very, very closely mirror the divorce statistics outside the church. So we're really not doing any better. And when you look at the statistics for being a virgin when you're married, they're the same in the church as they are outside of the church. So we're not doing any better. So however we have been doing it, it's not working. And so we need to figure out a more biblically sound way of approaching sexuality and marriage so that people are entering into marriage with a much stronger foundation. And we start shifting from my marriage was screwed up for 5 to 10 years, and then we got help, to we started our marriage on a good foundation because we had the help from the beginning. Because we're kind of still in that our marriage was screwed up for X amount of time until we got help stage of things. And that's true for the church. So that probably doesn't answer your question. But again, these are things that it needs to be a church discussion from the beginning all the way through. And I think if we had more of these high levels of family and church involvement from the beginning, we would have less of these, like, emergency scenarios at the end, where all of a sudden, because a lot of the times, like, you have these divorces, but, like, the divorce ends here, but it started 20 years ago. And if they got help 20 years ago, we never would have got to this point. Especially in the situations in which are for sexual immorality. Because again, I think there was a point in the divorce teaching where it just kind of be like, oh, they cheated on you, well, you can just divorce them. And I don't think that's supposed to be the solution. And a lot of sexual immorality within marriage has a long runway before we finally hit takeoff. But because none of that ever got dealt with, people are just so hurt that it's so hard to get to that forgiveness piece. Whereas if we had backed it up, like we might have been able to save that marriage. And even though sexual morality was part of it, sexual immorality should not necessitate a divorce, in my opinion, the way I understand Scripture. It's sexual morality is where we now open the door to divorce being one of the acceptable outcomes, but it's not the default outcome. And we need to kind of work on that stuff. But, and on the second time, this is all we got to remember. I think the church has kind of made an idol out of virginity in a certain way, even in a situation in a marriage where there has been sexual immorality. God still forgives, God still redeems, God still heals, God can still take all that and use it for His good. And you can still have a godly covenant marriage that He wants. And so we got to find that middle ground where we're taking it seriously, but on the other hand, we're also not forgetting like God's forgiveness and healing and restorative powers. Okay, Lionel, Vicky, then Becky.
Yeah, so back when that question was asked,
Yeah.
So on the liberal side, they had a list of
Yes,
reasons that you could divorce.
And
your
if I
wife.
understand it correctly, it was related to like marital responsibilities.
Okay.
So like
Now,
you couldn't
was that
divorce.
reciprocal? I mean, could the woman
I
ask
mean,
for a divorce
I
based
think
on those things?
I think it.
Or was it a man's world?
I think
Obviously, it's a man's
in
world.
theory, someone probably would have said it was reciprocal, but it probably wouldn't ever actually work out that way because the man's responsibilities were fairly light at this point within history. Like pretty much all the domestic stuff was the responsibility of the wife.
So most of the reasons for divorce were on the domestic
We're on the
side.
wife.
Yeah.
Yeah. And which, again, like, from my understanding of Hillel, I probably don't think Hillel would have approached it that way. Like, from what we understand, it would appear that Hillel was a faithful Jew who loved God and loved people and was justified by his faith. But again, this is how when these things develop 2 generations later, we know the Pharisees were not those people. You know. All right, Vicky.
Just one comment on what you had said about the divorce rate being the same in the Christian church as well as the world. At least for the most part, the Christians are getting married, so maybe there just are more marriages.
Yeah, that might be
there,
true.
You know, because
and part
the
of it,
world is not
the
probably.
divorce rates, the statistics are not weighted very well. Like you'll often hear it's like 50%. But what they're not doing in that 50% is most people who have been divorced are more likely to have a second divorce than people who have never been divorced having their first divorce. And then if you've had your second divorce, the stats for a third and fourth go way up. And so that stat of 50% of marriages, that is not accounting for people who are divorced and remarried multiple times. If you account for that, the number does go down. It's still very significant. But then again, the stats for people being married in the church is also going down. There's a lot more people in the church that are just living together.
Living together. Okay. Now, what back in biblical times? Okay. What was the procedure that they used to get? I mean, did they have to go before the rabbi? What did they do to get a divorce? Do you know?
The husband had to write a certificate, and then they had to present that certificate to the spouse. And then I think that point they were divorced. Oh. Like, I don't think there wasn't like a judge or a magistrate that you had to go before. I don't think. I'm ignorant about this, though. You don't know either. Do you?
No, they could write the certificate.
They could write the certificate.
They had to say it either 2 or 3 times
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, the same as like getting married. You didn't get married before a rabbi. You didn't get married for a magistrate. It was actually you would get married before your parents, I think. So the patriarch.
And the woman couldn't write a certificate of divorce.
The woman couldn't write a certificate of divorce? Yeah, okay.
No, that's why she kept her dowry, and that was the only thing she walked away with. That's why they wore lots of jewelry and stuff like that, because they could only take what was on their body.
Okay.
And so,
Yeah.
the
Wow.
parable, like the woman with looking.
The 10 coins.
Looking for the coin, that was her dowry.
That was,
That's
yeah.
why she was looking.
That was her dowry, yeah.
Okay. Well,
Oh, excuse me.
at our church in New York, we have a couple there whose daughter has, I don't know, she's been married a couple times, but she keeps marrying Muslims. And that was the thing, the guy just has to say it 2 or 3 times.
Right.
With some time in between, I want a divorce,
Yes.
so that's still, I guess that's
Yes.
what they do now.
I know
At least the
within
Muslims.
Islam, you do have to be married before a emir. I don't remember the called. But part of the marriage ceremony is the emir repeats 3 times. You are husband and wife. You are husband and wife. You are husband and wife. Yeah, it's much easier to get divorced within Islam than it is to get married.
Was it the same issue back then as we have today? You say today, the average people prefer to live together almost before they get married. Like a trial run.
Back then,
What was the issue about staying together if you weren't married?
back then, according to the Jewish law, if you were intimate before marriage, then like you were supposed to get married. There was no like long-term living together. There wasn't in Greco-Roman society, but they had a very strange and loose sexual ethic where you were supposed to get married, but you were also supposed. It was really, really weird. So like historically, at this period of time, I do not think there's much of a historical context of living together before you're married or something like that. Becky.
So I had a comment about just marriages nowadays, and I think getting away from that Disney mindset of like if you do it right and you pick the right person, it's happily ever after, and if you have disagreements in marriage, you're doing something wrong. Like any 2 people in a relationship are going to have issues to work through. I mean, it's that way with friendship. It's that way with any relationship. So I got this statistic from a podcast, but like healthy marriages, you have disagreements or discussions or whatever you want to call it on a regular basis. And that's not the measuring stick of a healthy marriage. It's how you do it. Like, does it end ugly?
Yeah.
Do you fight unfair? Like, that's what leads to an unhappy marriage. But if you come out of it where you both understand each other, like that's a healthy marriage. And if you're not having those, we'll take a look like, well, are you communicating? Like there's...
Right, are you just roommates?
Yeah, like if you're going past the superficial, you're going to have issues to work on and to deal with. So.
Yeah. And this is part of that whole long-term discussion that we're trying to have, like we just have to recognize and everybody has to admit that like we're all screwed up. And if you take 2 screwed up people and throw them together in the most profoundly intimate relationship in creation, it's probably going to be some issues. And that's normal. And there's nothing necessarily extra wrong with you if you're having marital trouble. You're just normal like everybody else. So let's figure it out. Let's deal with it. Take that mic over to Rebecca.
I'm just, I wanted to throw out there that the call to marriage in 1 Corinthians is heroic, like for a husband to love his wife like the church.
Yeah.
I struggle to, like, I love my children. And that's probably the best love relationship that I've ever had. But another broken human that I'm trying to life with, to love them like Christ loves the church, like that is huge.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is, I feel like an impossible goal, and we should fight for it. But I just wanted to throw that into the conversation, because that feels, even in the easiest relationship, on some days, that feels like a hard ass.
Yeah. Well, and especially when, no, I'm rabbit trail. Like when you put the the Colossians and the Ephesians thing in there, the whole husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church, love your wives as you love your own body. That is not in the context of you got married because you loved somebody. This idea of you get married because you love somebody is only like 200 years old. So, like Paul is writing that, and he's writing it to a Gentile community where you have two people who are married, and it's quite possible that they didn't even really know each other before they got married. They got married because of a family arrangement. They got married because of a business arrangement, economics. And so Paul is saying, like, husband, you didn't marry your wife because you loved her. But you are a Christian. You need to love your wife the way that Christ loves the church and gave himself for her to sanctify her. And you need to love your wife the way that Christ loves the church. And so, like Paul, he isn't putting the foundation of marriage on any sort of feelings or wafiness or infatuation or really anything that's related to the other person. He's saying, husband, because you are a Christian, and because God has divinely decreed in the very act of creation that the husband is the head of his wife and the wife is the Azir, you got to love your and love not just in a like I take care of you or I provide for you, but like the way Christ did. Like he had a genuine love for the church that he gave his life for them. And he's calling the husband to that kind of, relationship. And so when we think about marriage within this, like if we could back it up and even kind of not remove, but look past this, because for us nowadays, marriage is completely based on feelings. You have these feelings for this person, so you're going to spend the rest of your life with this person and blah, blah, blah. But that, like when the Bible talks about marriage, that idea of you married someone because of the way you felt is actually not part of the context. Now, it's not to say it never happened, but it's not, like when they think about who I'm going to marry someday, they're not thinking about who am I going to fall in love with. They're thinking about a socioeconomic or a political or a family kind of discussion. And chances are they were not even picking their spouses. Their parents were picking their spouses. Okay, so we got to bring all. So when you bring all this in, like it has to change how we as Christians think about biblical marriage within the context. And again, like the Roman world, they did kind of have this idea about husbands loving their wives, but it was kind of like, if you do it, it's a pretty good thing. But like it wasn't part of what marriage was about. And so what Paul is saying, like we don't realize how countercultural Paul's teaching about marriage was to that first generation, especially of Gentile Christians that were receiving it. And then even like when you look at divorce in the Roman world, I don't think was a really big thing. Again, because if you were the healthy Greco-Roman man, you were probably sleeping with between like 4 and 7 women. So you don't need to get divorced and remarried. You can just go and everybody's fine. So it was very, 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 very messed up. And even on the wife side of it, it's easy to overlook, because the idea of submitting to your husband as to Christ, it's in the cyclical response of like the church submits to Christ because of the way Christ loves us and the response of love. And within the Greco-Roman society, it was respect because very literally the husband had the power of life and death over his wife. And it was an authoritative control thing, but that's not the way it is within the church. So even like all of it together, and even the children's stuff, like to say don't provoke your children to wrath, like the Roman patriarch could literally legally kill his children if they were disobedient, and so like that whole package of the family, for us, we just take it for granted because we grew up in a society that the family structure is built around this idea. But these people, it wasn't quite that case. Okay, so back to Matthew chapter 19. Okay, so historically, we know that there was a debate amongst the rabbis at the time as to which rabbinical school was correct. And so these Pharisees come to Jesus, and they are asking him to weigh in on this debate. And what's really fun about this one is, I think, historically, if you look at Jesus' teaching, he more often ends up on the Hillel side of the spectrum, except right here where he is solidly on the Shammai side. And so Jesus, in verse 4, says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Okay, and then the conversation is going to continue, and then this is where we're going to get this idea of sexual immorality being a possible grounds for divorce. There's a couple things in here that I want to point out. Okay, first, when we look at that Genesis 2 passage, it is not clear when that Genesis 2 passage says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." It's not clear who is making this statement. But according to Jesus' understanding of Genesis 2, it is the same person that created male and female is the one who said, "Therefore a man shall leave his mother and his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." That was spoken by God in the presence of Adam and Eve. Okay? And so we have this within the context of the Old Testament covenant marriage between a husband and a wife and God. And the Old Testament understanding of marriage is that it is a covenant, and then it's a covenant that two people enter into with each other, and those two people enter into with God. All right? And then again, Jesus brings in this one flesh idea, which when we look at, last week when we looked at Paul's interpretation, Paul connected this one flesh specifically with sexual intimacy. And it's something that is occurring within the spiritual dimension of life, similar to our connection with Christ. Jesus is also connecting this with this covenant idea, and then he says, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." So the way Paul talked about this in 1 Corinthians 6, the implication was that it was some kind of natural process, and that especially because it was going on when that married man was being sexually intimate with a temple prostitute, some sort of spiritual connection was being forged. But Jesus says that there's also, and personally I think this is a separate thing, that there's something that God is doing when he is taking two people and he is joining them together. And it's within this context of the covenant relationship. And I think, personally, I think this is a related but distinct thing that is happening than what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians. Because I don't think when this Corinthian man who is married was being sexually intimate with a temple prostitute, that God was in some way joining them together. That may be the case, but that doesn't really seem like it fits with the overall picture of how God regards marriage and sexual intimacy. In fact, I think it's specifically counterproductive because, like he's saying, when you are sexually intimate with a prostitute, that is outside of a marriage. But to use like a good Old Testament analogy, when we think of like fire, fire is one of the most destructive natural phenomena. When it is out of control, but when fire is brought into control, it's very, very useful and it's life-sustaining. And so I think the way the Bible kind of presents it, when we have sexual intimacy, and we have the covenant relationship of marriage that are very closely integrated, but they are distinct things. Okay, because you can be sexually intimate outside of the covenant of marriage, and we'll look at this in a minute. You can be within the covenant marriage and not be practicing healthy sexual intimacy. But you think of marriage and God's joining of two people in marriage in a spiritual dimension of reality as kind of like being the hearth that contains the fire and makes it a healthy thing instead of a destructive thing. And part of the reason why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6 that sexual immorality is a uniquely destructive sin is because when it is outside of this structure of covenant marriage that God himself has a hand in constructing, then we are outside of this safety structure that is supposed to help protect us and buffer us against the damage that sexual intimacy can cause. And so it's not just a natural process that when you have sexual intimacy between two people, there's a spiritual connection. But within the covenant of marriage itself, God also does something within the spiritual dimensions of life where he is joining two people together. And even if that is taking place in the process of covenant marriage, you can have that theoretically in the absence of sexual intimacy. And I don't think that's God's intent, but I think they are two separate things that are supposed to be kind of joined together. Okay? And there's a lot of speculation in there, but I'm just trying to resolve these understandings of the significance of Genesis chapter 2 from these different perspectives. So Paul is saying there is something that happens between any people that are sexually intimate. But Jesus is also saying there's something that God specifically does to a husband and wife when they enter into the covenant of marriage. And the biblical theme would seem to say that these two things are supposed to exist together in concurrence with one another. Okay, and then to further extend that thought, this is where we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. All right, and this follows the contents of context of 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And this is actually the first time in the book of Corinthians where we see the phrase, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. And so this is, again, where Paul is now specifically going to start addressing issues that were brought up from the letter that the Corinthian church sent to him. And I believe the ESV is correct in putting this next line in quotes, where this is a claim that is being taught within the Corinthian church. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And I think if we look at the whole context of chapter 7, Paul would agree with this statement, but not the way that the church at Corinth is applying it. And it would appear, again, this is the people that do this, based on what Paul is saying and then other traditions that we see within the early church, there was a movement within the early church that taught that sexual intimacy between husbands and wives was immoral. And that you should get married, but you shouldn't be sexually intimate. And I think Paul is specifically addressing that issue here within this first paragraph. Because he says, but, verse 2, because of the temptation to sexual morality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so the default assumption of the Bible is that within a healthy biblical marriage, there is a healthy sexual intimacy. I want to emphasize healthy. Okay, I want to be very clear that, that Paul is not saying, spouse, you need to submit yourself to an unhealthy or abusive sexual intimacy. Period. I think what the Bible is doing is that it is calling both spouses to a responsibility to have healthy sexual intimacy within your marriage. Which means there has to be communication about it within the marriage, and then there has to be communication about it with the church. And those are very awkward conversations, but I think the Bible is assuming that this is happening. And that if you have a covenant marriage relationship that does not have a healthy sexual intimacy in there, then that is something that is supposed to be dealt with. And the idea is, I mean, Paul says, like, he lays out, like, possibly by agreement for a limited time so that you must devote yourself to prayer. Like, he puts a very limiting factor on this idea of spouses not being intimate with one another. And so he really kind of narrows in the, okay, there might be an appropriate circumstance in which you would say, I need some time away from sexual intimacy. But, like, it's a very tight set of circumstances. And so, again, like, I think it kind of comes around that, like, proper sexual intimacy is supposed to be within the context of covenant marriage, but then proper covenant marriage is supposed to be in the context of proper sexual intimacy. And again, the Bible takes this way more seriously than I think the church has, and that is kind of what has led to so many problems. Because we're not doing a good foundational piece of discipling people into what like a biblical marriage and biblical sexual intimacy looks like. And then once they're in marriage, we're not doing a good job of the discipleship, counseling, all that kind of stuff of helping people walk through that, kind of through that process. And it's just really messy. Okay, Becky, Teresa.
Just a comment, like our society has this weird thing where like sex just seems to be everywhere, but it's not really in an honest, helpful way. It's just like either it's supposed to be funny or just kind of like arousing or whatever. But like there really isn't like a space in a conversation or even like terminology for just a casual conversation where it's helpful. It's like you can talk to your doctor or you can talk with your friend, but you can't really talk to your spouse.
We either have overly clinical terminology or we have offensive language.
Yeah. So and just being okay with it being awkward, like, okay, it's fine. But I mean, we can have a conversation and not just try to hurry up and rush through it and be like, we'll just do it.
Yeah.
It'll work itself out. Just do it. Like,
and even that kind of attitude, not the crude part of that came out of the 1900s, but the very overly prudish idea is more of like a Victorian era thing. I mean, Doug's talked about it several times. In your traditional Jewish marriage, the marriage would have been consummated at the marriage ceremony. And everyone would have been waiting for it to happen. And then after the consummation, the couple would have come back and they would have continued the marriage ceremony. So there was a much more comfortable, cultural idea of talking and experiencing these things than where we are at in Western society, and probably the extreme kind of offensive, nonchalant stage that we're in right now is in response to the overly restrictive shame kind of aspect of it that we can kind of trace back through the Puritans and into the Victorian era and that kind of stuff. So yeah, we keep swinging back and forth. We got to get kind of closer to the middle. You want to? Oh, you still
just real
going?
quick,
Okay.
and also like during the witch hunts and stuff, like a woman who was like sexual, like, oh well, she's a witch. So it just kind of became this like bad thing. Like if you're a good woman, then you're like, oh no, I don't do that kind of thing, you know? Like yeah. We just have a history of,
Yes.
Got to work out past that.
Puritan women were not supposed to have orgasms. You can hand the mic back to Teresa.
I guess
You got to hold it up.
my first thought was, when she just said that, is that, again, I keep looking at the example of the woman getting stoned. They didn't go after the man.
Right.
They go
Yeah.
after the woman. And
Yeah.
that still continues today.
Because if you catch someone in the act of adultery, it necessitates that there are two people.
Right. And even today in the high schools, a young lady that's active is called certain things. A
Right.
young man who's active,
It's considered normal and healthy.
deadly. Right.
Yeah.
So there's always been that double standard, and it continues even today. One of the things that I think that is nice for people to realize is that can be very important to a marriage, but also you can have a marriage without it
Yeah.
as we age. For
Right.
some of you, you're still young and you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
marry,
yeah.
I'm so, but as medical issues and aging occurs, you realize that the marriage covenant is important spiritually.
Yeah.
Even more, I will say it, my husband might disagree on days, even more than the sexual part is, because again, reality is, you've been together all these years, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it
There's
becomes
seasons.
difficult
Yeah.
with medical issues
Yep.
and things. And
Yep.
so having a look at, the marriage is made of two, not just one,
Yeah.
which I have run into, because my position I work at, is I have run into certain people that truly believe their marriage is over because sex is no longer occurring, and so they want to walk away. And it's like, what happened to the covenant of the spiritual?
Right. The God bringing two people together. Right. Yeah. And and it is, we're in a crazy time. Like I remember, I think I've told you guys about it before, but I was reading an article about, it was written by a lady, and I forget exactly the title, but basically it was like how to live with an asexual person, like someone who's not interested in sex. But as I was reading the article, the person she was dating, she said, my boyfriend, he is on the asexual spectrum because he only wants to have sex with me. And so they are equating monogamy with not desiring sex. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, lady, you're saying how hard it is to live with someone that wants to be committed to you. Like, this is insane. I'm like, and even I remember it's so random because now they have these terms like asexual and pansexual and all this kind of stuff and whatever. I was listening to a podcast, and it was not even about this. It's about these books that I read. But they did a podcast on sexual representation within these books. And it was funny because there's some men on there and there's some women on there. And everybody was giving their pronouns. And the men were like, I'm heterosexual or I'm bisexual or whatever. But then the women, they would always give two, and it would be like, I am bisexual, heteroromantic. And they were separating the people that you're physically attracted to versus the people that you're romantically attracted to. And I'm like, you're trying to separate this thing that can't be separated. But like that's kind of like where society is at, and it's a denial of reality. But because people are operating under these worldviews that are contrary to reality, they're just heaping trauma on themselves. And I'm like, if you're at the point where you need to explain that I'm attracted to both sexes, but I'm in a romantic relationship over here, and I even read another, what is it called? It's called cis passing, where like you're a bisexual person, but you're in a long-term committed relationship with only one person. And it's kind of criticized because it's like, well, you're denying your bisexual identity, but the people are like, but I want to be in a committed long-term relationship. And it's like, we're just tearing down these, and again, and the Bible's like, these are things that are ingrained into the very fabric of creation and what it means to be a human being. And we're trying to like pull these things apart, and it's not working. Go ahead, Becky. And then like again, like it's often said, like all sin comes down to sexual morality or idolatry, and then like I think we're becoming really aware of the sexual morality piece, but I think we're not really aware of the idolatry piece, and that's getting like just as bad. And it's like we're basically heading to be Canaan here within the next like 2 or 3 decades.
I think it's so unhealthy to like take that on as an identity. Like
Yeah.
I am
Who you are is not who you sleep
this,
with.
my sexuality, and it's so unhealthy because like what happens when you get rejected? It's like, you know what I mean? Like when your world is wrapped around that, like you're crushed. You know, like our identity is I'm a child of God. You know, no matter who loves me or rejects me,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
at the core, I'm okay.
Yeah.
Like it hurts. It still hurts to get rejected, but it's just, I don't know, I just think it's so sad to be like, that's my identity, and what happens when nobody wants you?
Yeah.
You know, or what happens when
Especially-
you're too old or too sick or medical issues and you can't be sexually active? Like, who are you? What good are you? You know what I mean? Like, it's just so sad.
Yeah, especially for kids too. Like, this is not even a discussion that like children should be having. Like, are they bisexual or whatever? And it's like, you're not old, like, you can't be married. Like you shouldn't even be thinking about who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. Like, you don't even brush your teeth every day. Like, it's like, come on. Like, what is going on here? Hand that back to Teresa.
I also think that young people, you can look at another person.
You got to hold it up.
Hello.
Yeah, there you go.
So young people, even old people, all of us, can look at another human being and say, that is beautiful.
That's an attractive person.
That it doesn't mean I'm going to get married to him, doesn't mean I'm going to have sex with him, but I could say, wow, that is gorgeous. Right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think the confusion a lot of times in children is being presented to them that if you're a female, if you think another female is gorgeous or good looking, or I wish my hair looked like that all of a sudden I'm attracted to women. No, it means you see beauty, both male and female. It doesn't mean you're attracted and you're planning on becoming, one place or another.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you won't, but I'm just saying
Yeah.
the concept of looking at something and saying that's good looking,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean you are leaning one way or the other. That's
Yeah.
where the questioning everybody starts putting on comes into. But
Yeah.
we had those same thoughts when we were young, but we didn't put it as questioning my sexuality.
Right.
We put it as this
Just-
other person's good looking.
It is part of growing up. Yeah. And, I had something just popped in my brain, I don't remember what it was. Yeah, and even, like, because we're kind of in this phase where, like, the default assumption is you should get married. And I think, even then, like, when you look at Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, like, I think we have misunderstood and miscommunicated the idea of the gift of singleness. Like, Paul seems to encourage people, you really need to think about this. And you really need to think that maybe, like, go through this discussion, like, is singleness an option? And he gives really good reasons for that. And I think in American society, and even kind of the church, we kind of have this idea that, like, if you're not sexually intimate with someone, you are in some way less of a person, or you're missing out on life, or there's something that is not like complete about you. And the Bible does not support that kind of idea at all. And I think that's something as a church we need to sit down and kind of look at again. I think in some ways we've made it too hard to get married, but in some ways we've encouraged it. Kind of like, it's almost like that everybody goes to college. And like these are some things that we need to look at. Go ahead, Chris, and then close this in prayer because I got to go.
Paul defines the purpose for the gift of singleness. It wasn't that you're single so you can enjoy life.
It was just
It
single
was single so
be-
you can enjoy God.
so you can be more impactful in the kingdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he poses the question of, it's almost, it's hard to find that balance. I got to do some more studying in it. Because Paul, it's clear that Paul preferred singleness because in singleness, there was nothing restraining your ability to devote your life to the kingdom. Now, he recognized marriage as a good and holy thing, but for Paul, it wasn't like a default and an exception. I think, again, this is just me talking off the top of my head right now, the way I understand it. I think Paul kind of presented these as two very valid options. And you as a person need to sit down and think about this and make this decision. And Paul was even saying, look, if you're engaged and you're looking at this and you're thinking like, I think I'd rather be single to devote myself from the kingdom, it's okay for you to break off that engagement. You're not doing anything wrong. Which within that culture would have been a very significant thing. Within the Jewish culture and even within the Roman culture, breaking off an engagement would have been a big no-no. But Paul was saying, look, if you want to keep your betrothed just as you're betrothed, you haven't sinned. And you really need to think about singleness because you can get a lot done that you can't when you're married. And so it's something I think we need to study more and talk about more in the future, but it's all in that context of that 1 Corinthians. All right, can you say it for next week?
I won't be here next week.
Okay, all right, do it real quick, and then I'm going to
But
start packing
I
up.
thought back in biblical times, betrothal was marriage.
It
You
wasn't.
just haven't come together yet, but it was as binding as marriage.
That's what made it not marriage 100%, but it was as legally binding as marriage within the Jewish context. That's why you had to, in order to become non-betrothed, you had to get a divorce within the Jewish context. So for Paul to write and say it is okay for you to break off the betrothal to live a life of singleness, again, we don't always get it. That would have been very countercultural for both the Jewish perspective and the Gentile perspective. Because in the Gentile perspective, you were betrothed because your family made this arrangement for economic or legal reasons, and you walking away was you like betraying your family. And Paul is saying, no, for the sake of singleness, for the sake of devoting yourself to the kingdom of God, you can walk away from this engagement and you are not sinning. Which would have been the natural assumption that people would have made. We can talk about it more next week. Good. Chris, close this prayer, please.
Father, we thank you for your word, for your wisdom, for your blessings, for our marriages. And we ask, Lord, in all that we do, we would do it with you and for you, because apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. And we pray as you continue to bury your word within our hearts that it may bear fruit for you in Jesus'